All right. Thank you all for coming on this very summery day. It's been a surprise a little bit, but I appreciate you all coming out. And I'm just going to introduce Elizabeth, so I'm going to get right to it. Elizabeth Hora is the founder and executive director of High Desert Heritage and Research. She has been a professional archaeologist for over 20 years and has worked in nearly every state in the West. Her interest in prehistoric rock imagery grew from her thesis work in the Uinta Basin, studying whether environmental and population pressures may have driven territorial actions like warfare. Now in her professional role, she brings archaeological interpretations to the public and teaches about the importance of preserving cultural heritage and preserving Native American artifacts. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Diane. All right, can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Okay, good. And I think, don't worry about this. This is so small, you'll never read it. But can everyone read this okay? All right, fantastic. I don't think we're in too much trouble tonight, but if we are, remember the slide and we'll go back and we'll explain it. So with that, hi, I'm Elizabeth. I just like to make sure that, because I never know how large the room is and things like that. And I want to make sure that you guys can see all of this because there's a lot of detail to some of these slides. I'm going to try to give you as many images as I can. People might have seen some of these before. I love it when we can talk about that. But I just want to make sure that we're ready. So tonight we're talking about Fremont Shield-Bearers, which is a particular type of human figure. You might hear me say anthropomorphic figure, but it's a human, on often sandstone walls like this, not only in Utah, but north and south across the Intermountain West. And so I'm Elizabeth Hora. I was public archaeologist here at the state of Utah for like 6 years, and then last summer decided to start my own 501c3. So I am now an archaeological nonprofit. I run called High Desert Heritage and Research. And what we do is we support people who have private collections of often Native American artifacts and other items, and we help unite them with the tribes, who have traditional ownership over those things. There's not currently support for that kind of stuff, and that's a huge hole that we started noticing in the public archaeology community. So that's a little bit about what I do now. And then the research part of that is really this, right? This grew out of the Northern Uinta Rock Imagery Project that I started at SHPO, and I'm sort of continuing on now. And it's because I just really love prehistoric rock imagery, and I really love the Uinta Fremont and the Fremont folk in general. So I currently live in Midway, not too far, just south of here on the other side of, not the big mountains, but like the mountains. And I'm originally from California, so I'm one of those. And I apologize to all the native Utahns in here. Married to that guy, mother to that guy. The other one, the green one, I don't really know him, but he good. So this picture was taken outside of the big quarry wall at Dinosaur National Monument, which is where I did a lot of my thesis research. Love dino. Really confused the kid that his mom was in Dinosaur National Monument, and I'm an archaeologist, but I don't do dinosaurs. He was like 4 here, and now that he's like close to 7, he can tell people like, yeah, my mom doesn't do dinosaurs. She's an archaeologist. So good for him. Okay, so quick show of hands. Who all has heard of the Fremont before? Oh my gosh, this is actually amazing. All right, and who can name any of the tribal groups that claim the Fremont as their ancestors? Way fewer hands, like 0 hands. Okay, we got one, fantastic. This is common. Almost nobody knows that the folks who were here, we've got Utah outlined, because that's roughly the shape of the Fremont world. Don't look too close at that. I'm sure that's not suspicious. But so not a ton of people know that the Fremont who lived here in Utah didn't just lay down their stuff one day and evaporate. That's actually a little bit what our textbooks say. I was surprised to find out last year. I was talking to a bunch of undergrads who were going into archaeology, and I asked them, when they think of the Fremont, who do they think of today? And they didn't know of any of these folks. They didn't know, Hopi is really closely related. So is Zuni, Acoma, Jemez, the Apache, the Western Apache, they trace their roots through the Fremont world too. And then the folks who are still here in Utah, like the Ute, the Goshute, the Paiute, the Shoshone, all of these people point to Utah and say, yeah, at some point in the past, we were there. And so when you're picking up these items from this area, you can call it whatever you like. You can call it archaic, you can call it Fremont, late prehistoric, but we see this as our ancestors. These are the things that our ancestors left behind. And so there is a section of archaeology that kind of details where people go in their migration histories. And here in Utah, we're just starting to understand some of the migration histories. This has a lot to do with shield-bearers. We'll circle back to that. So the Fremont period, the Fremont millennium really was around 400 AD to 1300 AD. Do not worry about dates. The dates don't matter. Just know, from like 0-ish AD to the Dark Ages, somewhere in there. That's when across this area, people were blending together two different lifeways. People were hunting and gathering as they had done for 8,000 years prior. I just need to pause on that really quick because 8,000 years is a long time for people to say, this is actually the best way of life we have. It's not that people weren't interested in inventing and moving on to something different, but why would you, right? If my underwear drawer is in the middle of my dresser and I automatically go there and I'm comfortable with that, why would I mess around with this, right? This is working for me. This is a system that works, causes me no friction. It's good to go. But something was going on in the first couple hundred years CE or AD that made people think, maybe this thing that I've done and my ancestors way back for 8,000 years, maybe something could be improved upon. And we're thinking that's probably climate, right? Farming is hard work. And unless you have a good reason to, you're not going to put in the elbow grease to do a lot of farming. If you think about it, farming, okay, the alternative, right? Hiking and snacking. If that's your way of life, what are you going to have to give up? What are you going to have to, I'll tell you what you have to give up, but what do you have to need in order to force you into a lifestyle where now you're putting a lot of effort into building shelter? Now you've got to figure out, what you're going to do with your poop and your garbage, right? You used to just be able to walk away and it was cool. Now you're living there for years, decades. It's going to get pretty gross pretty fast. So we've got to start figuring these things out, and it's because the environment's getting worse. We've got to put in more work to squeeze out a living from the environment. Rather than taking a hike and relying on blueberries and pinyon to bring us through, now we've got to get our corn, beans, and squash going to make sure that we've got that surplus because we don't know what next year is going to bring. It's kind of a lot like today, right? Where the environment's getting really unpredictable. And you could just think about all of the things that you're doing to hedge those bets, right? Maybe you're taking out more insurance. It's the same thing. These folks were taking out insurance, and their form of economic currency was really just food at this point. Not everyone was farming in the Fremont world. And this is where we really see that people were doing stuff differently than the Pueblos. Some people continued to hunt and gather, while some people were farming. And it's really the blending of this that creates the Fremont world, because that creates a lot of resiliency in the system. And it also creates a lot of opportunities that might be otherwise hard to get. You could see the folks here, these are the Pillings figurines. You could see they've got beautiful necklaces. Maybe that's shell, maybe that's stone. We do find out here shell from California and the Gulf of California, and turquoise from mines in Arizona and Nevada. People were bringing those in here, and the people who were probably bringing those were probably those hunters and gatherers. They were the ones who were still traveling long distances, right? You're still moving a lot in order to hunt in part of the year, and then go to wetlands part of the year, go to your high catchment areas part of the year. You're covering a lot of ground, you're meeting a lot of people. They're bringing goods into these village sites, and when they're in the village sites, they're able to trade with the farmers who are going to be able to give them dried corn that allow them to keep going. So this is a really resilient system that these folks built. The Uinta Fremont are doing the same thing, just in the Uinta Basin. Hey, it's easy enough. So if you guys have not been, actually, raise a show of hands again. Who has been and seen some of the rock imagery up and around the vernal area? Oh, okay, good. I was like, oh, no one has? Yeah, if you haven't, it seems like most people have, definitely go. There is some beautiful stuff out here. So the Uinta Fremont loved to draw huge people. Like, this is one of the smaller folks, but if you go out to McConkey Ranch, there are anthropomorphs, human figures that are like a couple meters tall. Sometimes quite often taller than actually human-sized. And we have seen over and over again that this is such an interesting way of depicting the human body. The Northern Uinta Rock Imagery Project, we looked at the patterns within regalia before. Now we're looking at just one sort of person, that shield-bearing warrior. And the shield-bearing warrior, people have suggested for decades that the Uinta Basin might be central to this whole, pan-regional motif. The shield-bearing warrior, we can find shield-bearing warriors from, the southern bits of Canada on this side of the Rocky Mountains, all the way down through the Pueblo world. It's a huge, long north-south swath, and we think that it's a lot of it might be coming or entirely coming from the Uinta Basin. This is a really interesting idea. And as I was going through a lot of the rock imagery for the Uinta Rock Imagery Project, I was looking at it and thinking to myself that there must be a way to quantify this. A lot of what we do in rock imagery research, we don't really quantify things. We kind of just look at stuff and we say, oh, this looks similar to this here. All right, that's pretty cool. I love that. I really like math, I really like data, and I really like being able to say something conclusively from that. So I started thinking, how are we going to consider whether this is an origin point or not? Hang on, we're getting some weird feedback here. I think it's my necklace. Let me take this off. I keep hearing something. That's totally it. All right. Oh my gosh, it's so much better. Okay, great. Fantastic. All right. So now we're bringing this back into the people from that earlier slide, right? And how we're applying the idea of shield-bearing warriors as a way to find a central point, or more accurately, as a way to track migration out of a central point. And to do this, we're looking at what I'm calling here the linguistic bifurcation model. So we've got a few researchers based out of Colorado in the Four Corners area for the most part, who have theorized that people who were speaking two different language groups, Proto-Hopi, so people who later would be speaking a language that would become Hopi, pre-Hopi, and Proto-Kiowa-Tanoan, so here we are, people speaking languages that would later become Kiowa, which are in Oklahoma now, those folks, and Tanoan, most of the Tanoan speakers are down in here in the Rio Grande. People who were speaking a language that would someday become those. They start off here in the central Mesa Verde area, and at different points, they migrate up. And they sit here in the Uinta Basin. Roughly, that's where the Uinta Basin is. What we're interested in here is when they're leaving that, right? And we're starting to look at what you might call like ethnogenesis, or where a particular ethnographic group might find their origin points. And so we're thinking this might be an origin point. If it's an origin point for shield-bearing warriors, so an origin point for the people drawing shield-bearing warriors. So we've got folks here who are speaking these two different languages, pre-Hopi and Proto-Kiowa-Tanoan, and we see that they leave the Uinta Basin at two different points. So around 1000 AD, pre-Hopi speaking people come and they are moving down here to the San Juan area. It's probably where cousins are, right? We do find that there are some artifacts from this area that have been brought up into the Uinta Basin, particularly San Juan redware, really only manufactured in the Blanding area. And that makes its way all the way up here, which suggests to us that people have some ties and some connections to folks. And then we see, linguistically, when people are trundling back down, love to see that. The other group, the Proto-Kiowa-Tanoan speaking people, they hang out here for a little bit longer. They stick out for about 300 years more until it's really probably environmental stuff that prompts them to go forward into the Yellowstone area. I apologize. And so these folks, we see their migration up here, again, through linguistics, and then getting into the Yellowstone area, that's where people who are Kiowa today say, this is our origin point, this is where we came from. And it was in that migration from Yellowstone up and over and around the Rockies and down into the plains where they say that's when we became Kiowa. It was in this travel and meeting these people that really forged who we are. So this is, again, ethnogenesis. This is the origins of these folks. And so we do have that like archaeolinguistic model saying we see this bifurcation of people going north and south. So what else do we see? Do we see the shield-bearers going north and south? We see shield-bearers are north and south, but dating is pretty hard. And we see that people have gone north and south. So how can we blend these together? Like I said, there hasn't been a ton of research on it, but people have compiled a lot of data, kind of just matchy-matchy, right? This looks pretty similar. This looks more or less the same. Okay. Before I bore you with too much math, we're gonna look at pictures of shields. Seemed better. So the shields that we're looking for, when we're thinking about dating, one of the ways that we're able to date these is based on types of shields. We have two types. This is the earliest type of shield we find, called a coiled shield. And it's a basketry shield made the same way that you coil baskets. They tend to be roughly all the same size, and this will be about the size that later hide shields are. They're about this long, they're about a meter, a little more. And so you could see here a couple cool things going on with this. We have some beautiful, that's not right. That's not the one I want. We have some beautiful decoration going on, and we actually have two layers of decoration. It might be a little bit tough to see. So here you can see we have a checkerboard pattern. We've got yellow and black, boop, boop, two lines of checkerboard. And of course, this like dark red in the center, that's fairly easy to see. We might have, it looks like maybe no banding in here. That might have been left clear. We also, and this is a little tougher to see, can you see this like black splotch here? And some black splotch down here? That is a human figure or a frog figure, a little hard to say. So there's, I've got Jolie 2022 here. He's done a really fantastic job of looking at these designs. He found, I want to say, 5 coiled shields, a few of which had never been identified before, in museum collections across northern Arizona and Utah. And so this is just really beautiful. Like, people have used this for long enough that they drew a couple of times on it, right? They said, first we want to get this cool geometric design, and you can even see some of the black over the ochre pigment here. Now we want to draw this more organic stuff on it. So these shields, really important to note, the coil lines, they go whoop, 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 whoop. We see so much of that. So when we were going through our analysis, we took note of things that may or may not be shields, but certainly were concentric circles or were coils in some way, were spirals. A lot of the spirals we didn't keep in, but some of the concentric circles, especially when you had humans around them, even added on later, we did keep those in our analysis. All right, our second type of shield is the hide shield. So this is the Pechtel family, Edward Pechtel and a couple of his kids here. They were outside of Torrey, Utah, and they found, I want to say 3, maybe 4 hide shields in a dry alcove. And, it's a black and white photo, but you could see here too that there's a lot of effort put into decoration, and this decoration, interestingly, is not radially symmetrical. It's kind of more eccentric in that way. It looks like it might be bilaterally symmetrical, right? Like this one, if you mirrored it on this line, it would be symmetrical. Same sorts of way that it was constructed in terms of painting, but in terms of actually making it, you make a sort of wicker frame, that round frame, and then you tan your hides directly on it, and you tan a few different layers of hide in order to make it nice and firm. This also gives you the opportunity to put different sorts of like talismans and things that might be important in between the layers to really give that war magic or war medicine, as would later be called by Kiowa folks. So these shields were very individualistic. Their designs weren't always repeated, which is something really, at least in the historic period, something really unique. And really brightly colored, really brilliant, really beautiful. And always, I'm a little short, but from about chin to about somewhere mid-thigh. Because that's the important part of the body that you really want to keep covered in a fight. Okay, here we've got some of our shield bearers, and we got your legs right at the chin. That's how we like to see it. I don't know if this guy is just a shield bearer. He's got like the radio antenna ears up here. He's cool though. Okay, so here's our research question. Did shield-bearing warrior traits change over time? We can't necessarily see the people moving, right? But we should expect that in the center point, there should be a good agreement on what is a shield-bearing warrior. A shield-bearing warrior should look these sorts of ways because we're communicating an idea to an audience and we're communicating a relatively new idea. People might have been using these shields, but they weren't being depicted until around, the middle to late part of the Fremont period. We don't necessarily, again, know, but the sites that have been dated near these shield-bearing warriors, they don't tend to be a lot earlier than about 800 AD. So we've got our center point. Do we see that things hang together well in the center point? And do we see that there's patterned distancing out from the center point? Do we see that things look more like the center than they look like each other on the periphery? And that might say that, okay, well, as people were moving across time, they needed to adapt and modify their idea of what is a shield-bearing warrior, or they adapt and modify their idea of what is how you depict a shield-bearing warrior, because we're still trying to optimize things for protection, possibly warfare, right? And so if you come into a bunch of people who say, oh, you know what, red on your shield? No way, man, red on your shield, that's gonna bring you the wrong type of attention. Someone who came in new to an area might be like, okay, well, I will change my ways. So do something like that pattern. And methods. Here's where, if you're not into like the data science part, I do try to keep a picture on the right-hand side. So you could just enjoy that. This is from the Pueblo world down, south of what's now the 70 freeway. So for our methods, I had students help, which was amazing because we were able to draw and evaluate hundreds of these, I called them round things for a long time. We weren't assuming any of them were shields or shield bearers. We just said, if it's round, draw it. And then these students would say, do I really have to draw this one? Yeah. We just did that for a few months. I also was able to gather data through WyoTrack, which is a Wyoming online database of archaeological sites, and Jim Kaiser has an amazing book where he drew all of these, so he did the hard work for us. I also had my poor students do some data entry for me. That was great. And then what that gave me was nominal level data, right? So I could say shield-bearing warrior X here has these traits, yes, no, or these traits on a scale. But that doesn't help me when I want to compare them to another person. So we did a site scale transformation of these nominal data. And again, if this is of no interest, then you can look at this cool guy who's got a really big, radially symmetrical shield and also a big hand for some reason. So have a moment, think about that while I talk about how we made our scale data. So in order to not have something just be a one-off each time, in order to have it be comparative, quantitatively, I made this into an index. I said, okay, we're gonna have shield-bearing warriors with whatever attribute, right? Shield-bearing warriors with a a neck visible versus all shield-bearing warriors from each site. And what that gave me was a number from between 0 to 1. So it's going to be, some 0 point blah number in that. And that, kind of makes it so that we can compare these things site to site. And that's going to make it useful when it's actually coming time for statistics. And guys, it's coming time for statistics. So what I ended up using was a Kruskal-Wallis test to compare whether the two samples, so each time I was going, Uinta Basin, Plains, Uinta Basin, Pueblo, Plains. So taking those two and saying, do these match together? Yes or no, how and why? And I am not, look guys, I can make the math, but then I can't remember the math, so I do have this written down. So what we have here is actually, in fact, not, okay. So what we've got going on are data characterization. So after I had these students suffer for most of a winter, we ended up with 420 round things. So they recorded 420 things into our database. Of those, we determined about half of them, a little more than half of them, to be shield bearers. So that would be, I've got a human, I could see some human stuff, and I could see something that follows that pattern of a shield. We did have some people who had shields that they were holding off to the side. These are interesting edge cases that we could explore. We also had 77 shields that were just floating out in the distance. We don't know if they were never pictured with a person or if that person has evaporated somehow, right? If we had just a petroglyph like this, was there a painted person nearby that eroded off? Unclear. And also, since we need to look at this as site level data, how many sites do we have? We had 117 total sites. The majority of them were from the Fremont world because that's where I live. And that's where I love, that's where I do my research. We had 32 ancestral Puebloan sites. Those were really only from Utah. And 16 from the Plains, which was mostly in Wyoming from that one. Maybe entirely from Wyoming. All right, so getting into it, what did we find when we looked at all of this stuff? When we looked at all of this, we did see that a lot of the variables, a lot of the results did conform to what we were thinking they would do. So again, we're looking at a Kruskal-Wallis, so are these same or different? And how we're gonna read this here is we're looking, this is not helpful, this is not the one. We're looking at our test, or our sigma, so we're gonna want that to be less than 0.05, and hooray, it is. So we do see a significant difference between these three populations. And looking at them here, we see that this one is significant, this one is also significant. So we see that this test is looking at the overall composition of a rock imagery panel and comparing how many shield-bearing warriors there are per panel compared to all of the other human figures in that same panel. So the Plains results do appear to be distinct from both the Pueblo and the Fremont. So again, like what we're looking at here is, how many shield-bearing warriors do we have versus how many of all human figures? And that's just looking at like when someone wants to draw a shield-bearing warrior, are there rules about the overall composition of the work? And we see that, yes, there are rules that the Fremont and the Pueblo are following, and the Plains is kind of doing some jazz on that. And like, good for them. Yeah. We'll talk about why that is. They have a good reason. All right. The second one is our shield depictions. So Fremont interior decoration. So not looking at the humans, just looking at the shields now. And we'll get a better picture of this shield in the next slide. Just looking at the shields, do we see that there are decorations for the shields? So for this, this is things that are on the interior of the shield, interior decoration here. That is like these red and white stripes count as interior decoration. This horn coming out, that's exterior to it, right? So we're going to quantify those too. So are there rules about should there be interior decoration? And again, we didn't quantify types of interior decoration because we do expect, and we did find, a lot of idiosyncrasy. People were going with the war medicine that was working for them, or the war medicine that in Kiowa tradition was revealed to them through prayer or through dreaming. And so we did not see that very many motifs were repeated. So we were just like, okay, did they do interior decoration at all? And so Fremont interior decoration does appear to be distinct from both Pueblo and the Plains populations, which is actually contrary to what I might have expected if I thought that people were moving up and down here. Since we're expecting that the Fremont people might have seeded some segments of later Hopi, Pueblo, and Kiowa Plains tribes, I would have expected to see at least one of these be similar to the Fremont. Maybe this is reflecting a later change in shield materials. We probably are not making too many more basketry shields once hide becomes easily available, especially when you become a Plains tribe, because hide does a better job. So maybe it's reflecting a change in the shield materials, or maybe later folks were using just totally different ways of getting at their designs, right? Maybe there was an idea of what this meant when you were Fremont, but once we moved from being Fremont and we started becoming other people, maybe we branched out. All right, and so this is for these exterior decorations. So how often do we see cool dangly bobs is the technical term. So here we've got some horns, right? Some bison horns, love to see it. Other exterior designs, we do see a lot of things dangling from here, probably indicative of feathers. What's really cool, I love seeing these dangling ones, especially if we're not sure, is this a shield or not? Because dangling indicates that this is a physical item that exists in the real world that is subject to the laws of gravity, right? Why, if this was just a blobbity hanging out in space, you wouldn't have something that dangled. But if you had seen shields and you knew how those feathers were going to move, that's how you would do it, right? These point upward. They're anchored. We're not getting as much data there. It's potentially defying the laws of physics, but I love to see dangling feathers. That said, we didn't really find any. The Crustable-Wallace test did not find any difference between the three populations, so we didn't run any of the pairwise comparisons to cover up the images. And when I went back into the data and said, well, why? Okay, these are all, none of these are distinct populations. What gives? It's because there were just so few things that were meeting the test description. So for whatever reason, things that we see today do not have a lot of exterior stuff. They have more interior design. This might be a problem of rain and sun and wind. It might be that these things were painted on and they just didn't last their time, but we don't know. So that is a inconclusive one. All right, couple more. We're gonna move on to what human bodies looked like. So what are the laws defining how you're going to draw a human body? And there's a couple of cool tangents here that we can take too. But I was just looking at a couple of different things. So in the Uinta Basin, people had really clear depictions about what someone's head should be looking like and what someone's neck should look like, and more to the point, whether we should care that they have a neck. And especially when you're looking at shield-bearing warriors, a lot of us are keeping our shields right under our chin, it turns out, and so we're obscuring the neck. These folks, once you get really close to this, you can see that this shield was pecked on later. This big person existed first. Well, actually first, this little girly down here existed. This is probably a woman. And then there's another person up here, you could see part of their necklace. And then there's a few other artifacts down here where you could see that these huge figures had been drawn over earlier smaller people. So later folks were like, absolutely not, we'll be bigger and better. And then even after that, even after those folks, someone came by and was like, no, these boys belong to us and we are making them into shield-bearing warriors. You can see, this shows very poor planning. Really not in the tradition of what people who were Fremont were doing at the time, right? They they took a lot of care into scale and accommodating size. They would not have drawn it like this. So they might have been later Fremont people who did this, but certainly not the original artist who drew these large figures. Okay. But getting back into human body depictions, so that neck, there were some rules governing whether or not necks were featured in Uinta-style imagery. And here we see that there's no distinction between the three sample groups and how they depict people with and without necks. So it's a little, so the way the statistics work, we can't say like, yes, these are all the same population. We could say, no, we don't see distinctions. So this rule about how people were drawing the human body, that might have been enduring throughout time. So as people left the Uinta Basin, they might have kept with them like, no, it's really important that we draw people this way, which is great. Hooray. Doesn't disprove the hypothesis. And then our second one is head shape. Like I said, there's definitive rules as to how people are looking at heads. And head shape does have a huge difference. Fremont and Plains look a lot different from each other, right? Again, we're looking at this test statistic here. The Fremont and ancestral Pueblo, no real distinction there. Even Puebloan and Plains, no real distinction. That's interesting. But the Fremont and the Plains, we do see that there's a huge difference in how people feel like a human head should be drawn. Couple points on that. So this might be because the Wyoming data set looks very much like its own self. And so particularly in how heads are drawn, they were mostly just circular dots. Sometimes there weren't even facial features in there. There weren't enough facial features for us to feel like the analysis was worth it, right? So the Plains might look a lot different than the Fremont because the Plains were almost all circular, and in the Fremont world, there was a lot of variability. We had circular heads, it seems like especially later in time, whereas we had boxier heads, and then sometimes, you could call them fugitive heads where we just don't see what the outline was it might have been painted on. So the Plains are definitely differing, where the Pueblo necessarily are not. So how does that all look across time? What that looks like, in general, when we step back, is that we see that there are a lot of similarities, or at least we can't find a difference between that Fremont population, that seeding population, that origin population, and later folks who are moving north and south, which is really great and does support the hypothesis that these shield-bearing warriors are a good way to track people migrating out of the Uinta Basin. The really cool thing is that it does tell us something too about our data set and the people who were making it. So I mentioned that we were looking at Hopi, or we were looking at Pueblo data that was from, the northern Colorado area. I'm actually gonna zoom back to give you guys a map of where I'm talking about. Okay. So we're looking at Uinta, Pueblo, Plains. And we're seeing that here, people look a lot like the Uinta Basin, and here they're looking a lot different. There's probably a dating question here that's giving us a little twist. So the folks who are living here have a fairly tight timeline, especially on the latter end, and we see that people are moving out of this region by and large around 1275 AD, right? And so people who are leaving here at 1000 are really only, we know now, about to have 300 years on the outside in order to incubate new change. Versus when we come up here in our data set, we had some shield-bearing warrior who were on horseback. That shows a much greater time gap. So people up here, we're looking, our data set from up here is going to show, or I would hope it would show, more variability just because there's longer time for that change to incubate. There's longer time for people up in the Yellowstone area to say, the stuff that was working 500 years ago isn't really working for us now. We can probably, it's been a few hundred years. I'm sure Grandpa won't mind if we change it up a little bit, if we change the recipe. So we do see that that's what's happening. So a really interesting next step would be, let's look at what's going on further down in the Pueblo world, and especially as people start moving into the Rio Grande Valley, moving into Zuni and Hopi, getting really involved in Kachinas, we might see that there's a big difference in what their shield-bearing warriors look like. Let's zoom all the way out here. Yeah, so we do see, again, Pueblo and Uinta Basin, very similar. Plains and Uinta Basin, a lot less similar, but they still have enough similarities that they could likely have been from the same population. And we do see that those migration histories might offer a really good explanation for why we see the differences that we see. And again, future research going into the Pueblo world might help. Talking to living people might help as well. But we can use this method to interrogate other forms of Fremont material culture in new ways, right? No longer do we have to say like, well, I have this one figurine and I only have 3 other figurines to compare it to. You know, maybe we can find a creative way to squeeze some quantitative data out of that. It would be very helpful if we could date these sites a little bit better. And what that's probably going to entail is going back into the record saying, okay, you know, this one here on McConkey Ranch, it's spatially very close to these other villages. We can redate these village sites. We have much better radiocarbon dating now than we did even in the 80s and 90s. And I think that this method of looking at rock imagery in general is going to be a really great way to expand the utility of looking at images in prehistory so that it's not just a bunch of us going out and being like, wow, it's really neat. Well, anyway, do you want to go get lunch? And that's it for me tonight. So thank you guys so much. Appreciate your time. And we've got, I think, time for questions if that's what Diana would like. Okay. And so my understanding is that Diana's going to come around with the microphone. So if you want to raise your hand, Diana will see you and we can work from there. Let me give you, unless someone really loves references, let me get you a more interesting slide. Oh, this one. Yeah, that one's great.
Okay, you ready for the first question?
Yes.
Okay. Could the difference between the peoples who migrated into Wyoming and the plains differ from those that migrated south due to the fact that the people in the plains were probably not farming and they were not building houses in cliff sides?
Yep, absolutely. That's a really great question. Yeah, I mean, we do expect that they're going to be, even when they're in the Uinta Basin, we think that they might be following somewhat different ways of life. They're at least continuing to be linguistically distinct, right? So they might not be living in the same places. And like you said, they're going to be engaging in totally different life ways. The folks who go further south to meet with the Pueblo folks, now they're Pueblo for sure. And the people who are going up and over into the plains, yeah, they're necessarily engaging in a different way of life. So yes, we would expect to see that. And we do. With the really weird one of like a couple of these where like Fremont and Plains is differing, but Pueblo and Plains isn't. And I didn't really get a good explanation for why when I dug in. Just like, oh, I guess it circled back around and we're looking samesies again. I don't know. Maybe it was something, you know, pan-regionally where people were like, you know, these interior decorations, they're not working anymore, something like that. But yeah, it's really interesting. It's weird that it happens, but not fully. We don't fully see those results. Does that answer your question? Okay, great, thanks.
Hi, this is kind of a basic question. First of all, it looked like the Fremont were a lot of places. Like how, and what, so 2 things. What's the big expanse if we think of calling people Fremont, and what's their age banded? And then those physical shields that you showed us, what are the oldest shields? Have we actually found Fremont shields?
Such a great question.
How do those go?
Okay, so we've got a few of them. So let's start with geography. I'll just take them, because I think you laid it out in a really good way. That's not a great way to see the Fremont world. I don't know if my other one is any better though. Yeah, we're missing some of it. Let's go back up here. Okay, so no matter what we're doing, we're going to cut off this part of the West Desert So we'll just not care about the people in the West Desert. So on this side, we do see that we've got folks who are Fremont bumping out into this area. I've seen Fremont-ish things as far as Railroad Valley, couple valleys over in Nevada, but I mean, it's few and far between, right? We're not getting a lot. So really, this West Desert area, kind of hugging the 15, is where we see people making villages. And then we do expect that people who might be engaged in the Fremont way of life, who might be speaking those languages or like related to these folks, they are going out, like I said, as far as out here. Up and around here, around Elko, we've got a site called Scorpion Ridge, just outside Elko. We don't see a ton going further west than Elko. On the northern end, really, the Salt Lake is kind of our northern boundary. These mountains get a little bit hairy, and it seems like they kind of pen people in. Interestingly, when we get into Wyoming, we do find here in the Wyoming Basin that people are making pit houses and using grayware, which is a lot like the Fremont. And some people are brave enough to say Fremont. So, I mean, whether you want to call it Fremont or you want to call them Fremont-inspired, people were living a way of life, if not indicative of farming right there, indicative of like fangirling over farmers somewhere else. Here, we get really hemmed in by this western range. So you start going up into the Rocky Mountains, people stop being interested in trying to hoof it across these 14ers. And they also, they're not interested in trying to engage in really marginal agriculture, much higher than, you know, rifle, silt, places like that along the modern 70. We do see in here, in this area, if you want to take a little road trip, head down out through Vernal and then go south, just south of, is that Dinosaur? Rangeley? One of those. Go south there, and there's a road here, ton of shield-bearing warriors and Fremont imagery right here. That's really about as far east as we go. And then once you hit this area, it kind of feathers out into the Pueblo world, where we're starting to see things. We do see that there is a really big difference between Fremont and Pueblo. Like if you're, well, in some areas, if you're down here by Moab, you'll see a big distinction between Fremont and Pueblo. If you're down here in the St. George Kanab area, the distinction does get a little bit fuzzier. Those folks maybe were a little bit, you know, more simpatico, or at least they felt like their material culture was fine to look more like each other. I don't necessarily have a great reason for that. So that's kind of where the Fremont world is. And then internal to the Fremont world, we have lots of big village sites hugging our front right here, really right where the 15 is. And you'll notice too, it's where we have a lot of big agricultural villages ourselves, especially places like Richfield. This is a really big agricultural area. A lot of Fremont folks there. The margins here and the Vernal area, everywhere that you see farming now, people were farming in the past too. Our village sites, our largest one in the north is probably up here around Willard Bay. We don't really get too many village sites out here. We have Scorpion Ridge and Baker. Did I pass my thesis defense on that one? Okay. The age range. This is really squishy too. Where was it? So the age range, there's not a date when people are like, well, it's about 480 out here in the Uinta Basin. I do think it's time to start farming. We see that people are engaging in farming, which really transforms our earlier archaic folks into Fremont folks. They start engaging in farming earlier in the south and later in the north. But we do see that it kind of jumps over the middle there. And we get farming pretty early in the Uinta Basin. We see that that's a cultural shift that is following corn because corn lifeway is really important. So corn lifeway is this whole thing that comes up following like, okay, corn is not just important because we need to eat corn. Corn is important because people are corn. Corn is people. The Milky Way, that is a trail of cornmeal helping spirits get home. Everything about people is corn. Other animals, not growing corn. People are growing corn, and that's very cool. And to grow corn, now we need to really invest in our grinding stones. Now we start making site furniture grinding stones that are so particular looking. This doesn't necessarily have a good picture of it, but you can see a couple ground stones are featured here. Now we have this stuff, this corn, that I can't carry this all around. I have to store it somewhere. How am I going to store it with all of these other people? I don't know these guys. They're going to steal my stuff. So now we have to figure out how we're going to store things, perhaps communally. These might be communal storage basins so that everyone in the community has some sense of ownership over it. Or you're going to start having storage pits in your house. You're going to start guarding your house a little bit more, right? So it's changed how people view their landscape. It used to be you didn't have to have a lot of stuff stored somewhere. You would keep your nice metates, right, that maybe was handed down from your mom and your grandma. You're just stuffing that under a stage and you're kicking some dirt over it and you'll come back next year. And if you don't have it, it's a bummer, but it's not the end of the world. Now this is heirloomed down through the ages and there's someone who's jealous out there of it because yours is really beautiful. So social life changes a lot and it really has to do with how often people are staying in one place and being habituated to one spot. And then about 1300, you'll note it's really close to the 1275 for the Pueblo world. We see that people stop engaging in this because we get out of a big climate thing called the medieval climate anomaly. And we go into something called the Little Ice Age. We start getting into the Little Ice Age, which means that temperatures are cooler. We don't necessarily need to farm because there's enough stuff on the landscape again. So people re-engage in that hunting and gathering way of life that worked for all those thousands of years. And that, indeed, they never really gave up in the Fremont period. They just maybe didn't do that their whole life. Because at some point, you don't want to hike anymore. Okay. So is this the answer? Did I get it? Okay. One final one. Okay.
Physical shields.
The physical shields. Yeah. Golly, I don't remember how old these guys are. I want to say that this is late Fremont, but I can double check if that's important. I can tell you that these are by and large older. We don't have a lot of examples of them, and the examples we do have are from areas that naturally have dry caves, dry alcoves. So that's sort of, through south and central Utah and into northern Arizona. There's really very few of them. We can radiocarbon date these, and they radiocarbon date, let's say 900 to 1000 Zs. Again, I can double check that, but off the top of my head, I just know earlier and later. And so these, you can radiocarbon date these because they're bison hides. You'll know the year the bison died, which is cool. Like for this one, you'll know the year the grass died, the year someone ripped the grass out of the ground. Neither of these are things that linger on the landscape for very long once they've been separated from their living organism. So they're really wonderful for dating. So these are later, these might be 12. I don't think they would be much later than 1500, which you'll get people who are saying, well, they're not Fremont, but some people are still engaging in corn life way. Maybe they're Fremont, but so these folks, I think that it's the later half of the Fremont period. I don't think these are Pueblo shields. I believe these are Fremont. Okay.
Along with the Little Ice Age, wasn't that about the time a very large migration of Navajo people started showing up in the area?
Yeah, the Navajo migration, I think, was a little bit later. The Dene, the Athabascan-speaking folks, they do come out of Canada. I think during that time, what we might be seeing more likely is Apache folks coming through. The Apache folks, and then once there's sort of a vacuum in here, I don't know if it's necessarily people, but certainly a lifeway is coming in out of the Owens Valley in California. It is bringing in some folks. And then we get an ethnogenesis in this zone that people are going to become Ute and Paiute, Goshute, and Shoshone. And then down here, folks are going to solidify into Apache as a result of like, this is a new way of life and a new linguistic pattern, numic pattern, coming up out of the California desert. And it really is kind of, it's a small but meaningful revolution in how people are hunting and gathering. It's just how we can squeeze a little bit more out of like, all right, how much food do we have to carry? Like when we go to gather food, how much should we be bringing back with us? That kind of stuff. So it's not quite the Dene folks. They're coming a little bit later, but we do see that there's a lot of migration. And it's hard to know which is the cart and which is the horse. We think it's probably the environment is the horse, and then the cart is people coming in, finding a relative lack of folks in here and bringing in ideas, finding a relative lack of folks here, and finding that this is a good travel corridor to exit Canada and go to parts south. And again, they didn't have a plan. They weren't like, oh, I'm going to Window Rock. They were just on their way. They were just moving from their own stuff too. Yeah. They're very similar in time.
So I have perhaps a very obvious question, but when we look at the shields and the size of the shields among the Fremont, what is the purpose of the shield?
Great.
Is the purpose for protection from others within their tribe or their clan?
Mm-hmm.
Is it protection from the Pueblo people or others? Is it a sense of power from the size of it and who has it? And of course, we know the shamans are the ones producing the petroglyphs. Is the shield something that gives them authority? So what is the purpose of the shield during this time?
It's a really great question. We are so far back in history that it's a little hard for me to say in here what we would suggest is like the definitive or one of the answers. I can suggest, let's see, where do I have some good pictures? Hey, we go back to these guys. These guys have some of the cool swirly shields that are smaller than they are, right? So these are, at least the depictions, looks like the swirls came first, and then later people created humans next to them in order to hold on to them and be in relation to them. So there's some difference in how shields are being depicted, right? So there might be some differences in what people thought the importance of the shield spiritually were. That said, we do have some really great examples, some really great stories, some really great traditions out of the Kiowa and later the Rio Grande tribes, later in their histories about what these shields were good for. So in the Kiowa tradition, these shields are good for person-to-person warfare and combat. And this might be flavored by them being a plains tribe, and that was what was going on in the plains during the historic period here. But the story goes that a young man would, poor sore-eyed boy, sobbed himself to sleep one day, did want to die, and he was visited by Rock or Stone in a dream. And Stone said, hey man, I'll help you and I'll give you some protection. I'll give you my stone protection, right? You're not busting up me, a giant rock. And so here, you take this shield. This is what you need in order to have this huge protection. And buffalo's gonna help. Later, people have dreams where buffalo comes up to them and says, yeah, take this hide. I'm gonna help you. I'm a giant buffalo. It takes a lot to take me down. So things that are physically imposing and are powerful and are really like enduring, those are things that often, grant that war medicine. And war medicine becomes really important as people are getting into warfare, especially horse-mounted warfare. And we see that the size of the shield, really big early on, because you want to make sure that you are covered. And again, you've got all sorts of stuff in your shield that's giving you that spiritual help too. Once guns come to town, right? And they're coming at the same time as horses. And they are, in a lot of cases, coming before most of these folks have seen folks from Europe. They're getting the stuff before, and the diseases, before they're physically meeting those people who brought them to the continent. So once you're on horseback and you've got this great shield, but somebody shoots at you with a gun, that shield is not doing something that it used to do for hundreds of years, and now we need to work around that. So you're mounted on horseback, this ungainly shield, not even that big a help. The shield shrinks down. People start making smaller and smaller shields. People start putting a lot more emphasis on the things that are inside the shield and the design of the shield. Those are things that they can control and that keep them mobile and keep them nimble. Shields in the Kiowa tradition are personally given. The design is personally given to that warrior, but it can be sold. Like that warrior can say like, all right, well, this has been really good. And this shield, let me tell you all of the shields or all of the battles that I've, if not one, lived through with this shield. And, my days are over. I'll give this to the next person. You can name a price and we'll see if we can sell this shield. People can have more than one shield in that way too. Often they're not going to. But yeah, so these shields become their own important, economic commodities in and of themselves. Whereas in the Pueblo world, we see that people stop making shields for a little while. They're engaged in farming. We see that people are continuing to draw shield-bearing warriors over their farms, over their plots of land where they're growing their corn, beans, and squash. And so there's the thought that maybe that was, imbuing some sort of protective status over that. But it's not necessarily clear because that was before the ethnographic period. No one was there to ask that question, so that's just an idea. But we do not see a lot of shields being built at that time. What we do see is when the eastern Pueblos, so like Taos, right? When they start really trading with folks in the South, I'm trying to remember if that's who that is that they were trading with. Those folks had access to bison that the Pueblo folks didn't have. And the Pueblo folks saw these people with their amazing shields and said, make me a shield. And so shields were often not made by Pueblo folks in the later periods, but were acquired from Plains warriors. So they sort of did not see a need to continue making that tradition. They imported that. And that was really a lot later, right? That was after the Spanish incursion into the area too. So Pueblos still had warfare. They still were fighting in amongst each other from time to time, but maybe not necessarily using shields or not to the extent that they were before. Does that answer your question? I lost track. Okay, does that answer your question? So sorry. Okay.
Okay. I'm interested in how they constructed their artwork. Mm-hmm. Some of your pictures, quite obviously, they chiseled.
Yes.
Okay. They chiseled very long, very straight lines. That's very interesting. How is this done? This looks like there's some chiseling at the bottom. How are the human images created? Is that sort of scraped away at the rock?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love this. So we did look at petroglyph technique when we were doing this. We did not have the data from other areas, but in the Fremont world, I can tell you that there are three main ways that people are making these images. It's the hammer and chisel method, right? That pecking method, where you've got one sharp rock, one rock that's good for banging, and you do that. And then you can paint over that as well. There's a second one, which is abrading, which is what you were kind of talking about, like rubbing a rock over it. And this is not a great picture, but it does look like there's some abrasion. Let me see if I've got. This is a good example of that hammer and chisel. Not a great example of abrading. That's a little hard to see. Where are my guys? Okay. Do I have better guys? Do I have better guys? Yeah, I have better guys. These guys. Okay, so these guys. We've got stuff that's very obviously that pecking, right? You can see that there's even some stippling here. And we have the nice hangy downies that I love. Up in here, you can see that there's some abrasion. I was not able to get close to this. If you guys have been out to McConkey Ranch, this is like way high up. So I was looking at this through binoculars. But in other ones that were closer to the ground where I could get my eyeball and I have like a little jeweler's loop, there's a braiding and you can see the really clear braiding patterns. In a lot of these collars, we have abrasion, and then we do see a lot of abrasion in shields, more than I would expect. And that's not statistic, that's just a gestalt of it. I haven't necessarily looked at are shields abraded more than other elements of these human figures. The other thing that we see is incising. I don't see a lot of that here. Incising tends to occur later in the timeline, and it's just when people are taking a sharp implement and rubbing it back and forth, creating like a really nice deep groove. Etching, like if you were to go out and do this on the rock today, etching would be if you take your key and do a couple little scrapes. That's like a little etch. But then incising is if you like take that key or that like little knife and go through it a lot. We tend to see it a lot later, I think because of metal implements. I think we didn't have metal back then, and it's not very fun to try to incise something in this rock. You're gonna grind down your stone and you're gonna bother your ears. Versus abrading, which is just like, all right, I'll just rub this on there until it takes some of the top material off. So yes, did that answer the question, or did you have more about? Okay, great. Yeah, no, good eye. We do have a lot of those different techniques at play.
I'm kind of curious. In one of your petroglyphs, you had a warrior with little dots going over to another. No, the other one where you had the warrior. Nope. Keep going.
We'll find them. We got some warriors in here. Tons of them.
There, that one.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay, how do you interpret those little dots going from the guy on the warrior on the left and then the one that isn't so distinct on the right?
Yeah, I don't have an interpretation for that. Things are kind of one instance of a thing. It's okay. This is my philosophy on rock imagery, and it's just mine. You don't have to necessarily share it. But I do not come from a tradition that made this here in North America. So I don't have that cultural knowledge to read something, right? Like I can read our like little graphics on road signs, right? I can see, okay, that's going to be a historical site. It's got like a little Greek column thing on it. That's going to be a hike. We got a guy with a backpack and a stick. That might be something that's as obvious to someone who is descended from this group. It might not. These things do change over time, as we talked about. So because I'm not a member of that group and it's not something that I can see that patterned, similar, different stuff across time and space, I don't have an explanation for it. I can tell you that it may or may not have been contemporaneous to those people. This is a really cool one where we have many different periods of people returning to this same place and either embellishing or overwriting stuff. This was a really like turbulent place socially. So that might have been really meaningful for someone at one period of time and not meaningful for someone in a different period of time. Does that answer your question in the best way I can say no, I got no answer? Sorry.
Anyone else? No.
And I'll hang out for a little while if you have questions. Can I make a tiny pitch? So up here, I have some materials. If you or someone you love has a collection of items that you don't know what to do with, and this is happening a lot, let me know. We can help you out. This is a nonprofit that I just started 9 months ago. So we're just getting it off the ground. Any help you want to give in terms of like an Instagram follow even, that would be great. But I do have a bunch of stuff up here. If you're interested in learning more, please let me know. I'm happy to help. But yeah, and thank you guys so much.
Thank you,
It was a
Elizabeth.
really fun presentation. Thank you.